Hello and welcome to this episode of Philosophy for All. Today we're joined by two very special guests that have come onto the channel previously, Dr. Bob Hanna, who's come onto the channel to talk about Kant, as well as Dr. Aaron Simmons, who's talked about a range of things ranging from Levinas to Kierkegaard to Bonhoeffer. So in this video, we're going to be talking about what is the state of philosophy and where is it going. And perhaps to get started off with this discussion, to frame it, perhaps Dr. Hanna could start us off with telling us a bit more about what direction analytic philosophy is going in and what are some of the big debates in philosophy.
Yes, well, the way I think about the analytic tradition is that it's a late 19th, 20th century and 21st century tradition which originated in a rejection of idealist philosophy, particularly Kantian philosophy, but also post-Kantian absolute idealist philosophy. And in its early phase, it was highly oriented towards the project of logicism, which is the reduction of mathematics to pure formal logic. And so pure formal logic and the study of pure formal logic was a leading topic in the early tradition. Now, the logicist project fell apart by about 1950, in part because of internal criticism. I mean, there were problems with just the reduction strategy. Gödel's incompleteness theorems got in the way. Russell's paradox got in the way. But it also turned out to be the case that the reduction could not be carried out, and Quine, for instance, attacked the analytic-synthetic distinction, which was a cornerstone of this tradition. So by 1950, the end of the Second World War, or 45 and beyond, the end of the Second World War, the analytic tradition gave up its original logicist and highly formalist-oriented, set of core themes, and switched over to another form of, well, scientism, namely valorizing the natural sciences. And that's what I regard as the second phase of analytic philosophy. So classical analytic philosophy, logicist, logic-oriented philosophy for the first 50 or so years. And then since then, a more natural science-oriented philosophy since about 1950 forward to into the 21st century. As the post-classical analytic tradition has gone forward, it seems to me to have lost whatever mojo it had earlier on. I mean, one thing I've been exploring recently is, so when I was a graduate student, there were some fundamental results that people were interested in the the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. Say the new theory of reference, theory of natural kind terms, Kripke's idea that there's an analytic a posteriori, and so on, and a contingent a priori. Analytic a posteriori and a contingent a priori. And these were all things that people were grappling with. As the century ended and into the 20th century, analytic philosophers lost a certain amount of interest in that. And the tradition of what's called analytic metaphysics has continued on. And it's I think it's probably, if you had to identify two sets of themes that the post-classical analytic tradition is engaging with now. One is analytic metaphysics, and then the second would be finding foundations for the natural sciences. But I think those programs are largely petering out, and as analytic metaphysics, as the analytic tradition peters out, there's a transition towards who knows what, really. And I myself think that the tradition is going down into the ash heap of history. Primarily what unifies it these days is a hatred of this thing they call continental philosophy, which they don't really know what it is. They just know it's very bad, and that people who work in the quote unquote continental tradition don't reason, consistently, never pay attention to logical theory, and are anti-science. But it's just this ideological myth that they, put forward. And then the Kantian tradition and the Hegelian tradition get lumped in with, the quote unquote continental tradition, which is primarily a post-Kantian tradition. And so all sense of the history, of the flow of the history philosophy, I think, has been lost.
Yes, thank you for giving this framework. I think it's very helpful to understand this movement of analytic philosophy with the work that Aaron does in the continental philosophy. Can you tell us a bit more, firstly, what is continental philosophy? Because many people might come to this from an analytic perspective, or just as a generalist wanting to get into philosophy a bit more, to understand what continental philosophy is, and also what draws you to continental philosophy.
Yeah, so I think that the tricky thing, as Bob said, whenever you are trying to differentiate between different discursive traditions within the same discipline, it depends, who you ask. Because if you ask an analytic philosopher who identifies that way, well, what is continental philosophy? Definitionally, there's a kind of, well, something I don't do, right? That's part of the way it would make sense of themselves. As a person who does primarily continental philosophy in my own work, I think that one of the genuinely more exciting things happening in academic philosophy over the last decade or so has been, I really do think there's a newer generation that's a little bit younger than me that's beginning to just kind of not care about that distinction as much. And it becomes much more, I would put it, question-driven philosophy, drawing on whatever historical resources speak to those issues. And I think that this is actually, in some ways, a kind of legacy of what we might say the kind of critical turn in philosophy more broadly in the 80s and 90s. So as feminism and queer theory and race theory and critical theory, coming out of the Frankfurt School, that then also got sort of deployed in these more applied ways, all of that work, I think, invited philosophers of whatever stripe coming through grad school in the last, just say, 15 years to recognize that whatever they're doing, there's a deep, important interpretive dimension at stake in those practices. And so in that sense, my answer to, well, what is continental philosophy? I'll give you 3 possible ways to make sense of it. But I actually think that more and more and more, the distinction is less important than what are the questions that are motivating constructive work. And then Bob and I could draw on our individual backgrounds and traditions to say, ooh, look what it would look like to take up this question, let's say in metaphysics of AI and questions of personhood. Well, we both have plenty of resources within our traditions that might speak to that issue, right? And the really interesting stuff happening is drawing across those traditional boundaries, right? So here are 3 just possible ways to make sense of it. One, continental philosophy is a historical movement occurring, as Bob said, kind of post-Kantian and especially post-Hegelian, whereby 2 traditions in particular gained prominence. Phenomenology, coming out of Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and then existentialism, also coming out of Heidegger, but more drawing back on Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and then this moving up into 20th century thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Now, part of what those traditions, existentialism and phenomenology, do is give rise to a whole bunch of other methods and movements in the mid 20th century. Deconstruction, French feminism, new phenomenology, which is some work that I do. And so all of this way of looking at things it's more of a historical approach that is a umbrella term for a particular set of isms or methods that are distinctively clumped, generally in a kind of French and German inheritance, right? So that's kind of option 1 to make sense of continental philosophy. The second way we could think about it is in terms of, let's say, disposition, right? So Bob mentioned this logical commitment and then a kind of natural scientistic commitment being the sort of 2 modes or forms that we see in analytic philosophy in the 20th century. I would say continental philosophy generally has not been as enamored with the natural sciences as a discursive ideal, but instead has taken more impetus from you might say, the affective dimension on display in poetry, in literature, in the arts. So this is where, when one might say, oh, continental philosophy is not rigorous, it's not, argumentative. That's not true. It's just got often, historically, a different model of what rigor means, right? Still argument, still reason giving, still very much concerned with being precise and nuanced and very careful with the use of language, but doing so with an idea of a kind of embodied affect that lets the poet emerge as a little bit more of a model than the scientist, right? And then third, we could think about continental philosophy as, in some ways, a very narrow tradition. This is my least favorite of these definitions, but it's relevant to the way Bob defined analytic philosophy. A very narrow tradition that answered those early debates about logical precision differently than some of their colleagues. So, for example, Husserl was taking up questions of logicism differently than Frege. And then Frege gets frustrated and critiques Husserl. And Husserl revises his view and says, oh, shoot, yeah, I think he's right. But that means we go this direction away from what he called psychologism and more to a very particular rigorous science, but concerned with the way the world gives itself to our consciousness, a philosophy of experiential first-person encounter. But meanwhile, Frege, Russell, Quine are moving much more toward the objectivity of, you might, if not the third personal, at least something like that, right? The precision of our work is moving away from first personal encounter and more toward a kind of objectivist discourse that would be the case for anyone in this position. So this third alternative is one that says it's actually a family debate, right? We're all sitting at the same table in like the 1890s and early 1900s, and then some disagreements start emerging, and then the people at the table said, shoot, what y'all are doing is just kind of boring. We want to do something different. And they both were saying that about each other. And so you started to have this sort of divide open up. And some of the animosity on that model is actually not due to continental being poetic and analytic being scientific or whatever. It's more about, look, there are real stakes in claiming that they are wrong about this, because if they're right, this methodological trajectory inaugurated in the early 19 teens maybe doesn't work, right? So the disagreement is actually thick and robust and rigorous. So on any of these models, I would suggest they are all legacies of important disagreements, important distinctions. But right now, I'm less interested in the distinctions between continental analytic philosophy and way more interested in what are the questions that philosophers need to take up. How might we find resources across traditional divides? And for what it's worth, I would think that one of the most important things about that gesture is to think beyond philosophy as well, right? What are the other academic and scholarly disciplines upon which philosophers should draw as we do what we do as philosophers? And I think right now, the analytic crowd tends to still privilege science as, cognitive science in particular, right, as the mode in which we can learn things. Continental philosophers, I think, have and this is not better or worse, just a slightly larger set of interlocutors, right? Anthropology, sociology, creative writing, comparative literature, like all these sorts of discourses might be important people to be at the table when we're doing philosophy. And so my hope is that we find ways for these big tables to be places we all can sit.
That's quite fascinating. And perhaps we could flip the table back to Dr. Hanna to talk a bit more about his work on Kantian futurism. And since we have all these debates going on in a slight framework of what are these problems and discontents of, I guess, analytic philosophy, what are some ways in which you envision, I guess, going back to Kant in some sense could transform our discussions going forward?
Yes. Well, the way I've presented the origins of the analytic tradition, and indeed the origins of the quote unquote continental tradition, is that they both flow from, broadly speaking, Kantian philosophy, and more specifically neo-Kantian philosophy. So as Aaron rightly said, the disagreement, the apparent sharp dichotomy or gap between the analytic and continental traditions is in fact a domestic disagreement between philosophers, all of whom belong to the same tradition, really at its base, but are struggling now. They have this sort of anxiety of influence with respect to the origins of their traditions, and have pushed off or pretended that they're fundamentally different. So my suggestion is, so what would the options be beyond analytic philosophy and continental philosophy? And it seems to me that given the development of the, we even call it the post-Kantian tradition, all the options are within the logical space that's, framed by issue, positive or negative issues surrounding Kantian philosophy. So there's an outside possibility, a logical possibility, that some other wholly non-Kantian option in philosophy might emerge. But given the development of Anglo-European philosophy, and given the way that philosophy is now done all around the world and communicated, and given the military-industrial digital complex to which we all belong, I can't see that a wholly non-Anglo-European option can emerge. That being so, assuming that's so, then it must be some way of facing up to Kantian philosophy, facing up both analytic philosophers and continental philosophers, facing up to their Kantian origins, and then I think critically refining Kantian philosophy, sharing a vocabulary, a basic vocabulary, and also agreeing. I mean, philosophers never really agree, but at least in some fundamental procedural sense, agreeing about what would count as a solution to a problem, or what would count as progress towards solving a problem, or discovering that a problem is empty and discarding it. If you could come up with those, I think philosophy could progress, but at the same time also allowing for autonomy in philosophers' thinking, so that daring to think for themselves, but within a framework that other philosophers can actually understand what they're doing. And so the very idea of Kantian futurism is a reevaluation, a reimagining, a re-envisioning of Kantian philosophy, also to allow for this autonomous development of various new themes that no one has explored yet. So just to take one example, last couple of years I got into the philosophy of reading, which I discovered, there's very little that's ever been done on that. And you could do it in a Kantian way, you could do it in a hermeneutic way, and so on. But, it seems to me there should be room for that. One problem is that because the analytic tradition, the post-classical analytic tradition, dominates the social institution of philosophy, as you start as a graduate student, if you say, oh yeah, I want to fuse analytic philosophy and continental philosophy and go beyond it, they'll say, what? Say, what's your thesis topic? What are you going to write? What are you going to publish on? You need half a dozen articles in print before you can go on the market. What's your AOS, by the way? Everything? Generalists are people who know nothing. So I do think that this change towards, broadly Kantian, grappling with Kantian philosophy again, would also have to carry with it social institutional changes within the professional academy, and in particular within professional academic philosophy, in order for there then to be progress. All in all, it seems to me that the main block to progress in philosophy is the professionalization and academicization of philosophy, and the dominance, the hegemony of analytic philosophy.
And you touch upon three different aspects there. I think, firstly, in Kantian futurism, you have an analysis of the ideas of Kant. How can we go back to Kant and try to work out different ways in which the frameworks that Kant made could be interpreted in the strictly philosophical sense? Then there's a broader question of what other fields might we engage with in our pursuit for truth and the development of philosophy going forward. And finally, of course, the social and academic institutions that we would engage in. And all of those three things quite neatly sets up the framework, I suppose, for the main questions that we'll be discussing across the rest of this discussion. And perhaps, Aaron, can you tell us a bit more about what you think about returning to Kant, and I suppose from your continental perspective or the continental philosophy that you've worked with, how does that fit into your work?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I would phrase it differently. And in part, this is because Bob and I understand what we're doing, perhaps to slightly different audiences. So I don't have any real desire to say, well, the goal is to go back to this or that thinker, right? And if that were the case, I'm going to be much more inclined to say, and this is not because I specialize in ancient philosophy, but I'm going to say, let's go back to Aristotle and figure out what like the good of public education looks like in a context where, you know, the American president wants to eliminate the Department of Education. So for me, if I'm going back to look at like resources for the future of philosophy, I don't have a whole lot of dog in the fight of, oh, we've got to go back to this person as opposed to that one, right? Now, I've argued there are some really important resources in the history of philosophy. For me, Kierkegaard is one that shows up a lot in my work, but it's not so much distinctively the task is to become Kierkegaardians. I think Kierkegaard offers us an important invitation to rethink objectivity as a model for human value and social status, right? And so that's the thing that I think is so compelling, especially in a time when so many within at least white evangelicalism in the United States tend to think that objectivity is something that can be deployed without any hermeneutic nuance. The idea of challenging some of that by appealing to Kierkegaard, I think, is healthy. That said, Kant I find compelling, not so much because he's Kant, but because what he offers is a fundamental invitation to what Merrill Westphal will call Kantian anti-realism. And so it's the anti-realism that I find so compelling. And the basic idea would be, look, there probably is a mind-independent state of affairs that just is the case, right? And in fact, I'm a metaphysical realist. I think that that is, in fact, the right view to hold. But our embodied, perspectival, contingent, historical, cultural locations are always going to be facts of our existential matter that should give us pause in thinking that, as Westphal puts it, we can peek over God's shoulder to know the case as it is. So that basic Kantian insight that humility is radically important for all human discourse, that seems fundamental, foundational for any constructive continuation and future of philosophy, right? So in that sense, I would absolutely say, look, Kant's the guy. Let's go back to Kant so we can all go forward in light of this sort of essential humility anchored in the necessity of hermeneutics. And then let's actually maybe stop being so concerned about the radical insistence of, you know, epistemic clarity and certainty relative to the propositions that we affirm, and instead say, look, here's the reasons why I stand where I stand. Here's the best case I can offer for why I think this view, this account of what's the case has, you know, more support for it than its relevant rivals. And then realize that what we're doing is now a discursive practice, right? We are engaging as conversation partners in the midst of really difficult and complicated areas. And that, I think, Kant helps us to understand. The problem is, I think that far too many philosophers of whatever stripe tend to be a little bit too convinced that their favorite thinker is the answer to all of the world's social problems, right? This is what Fred Alford has a great essay that he defines this as the Levinas effect. And he says, far too many Levinas scholars run around saying, if we just read Levinas, everything would work out, right? And so that would be my only worry. And I don't think Bob's work does this at all. But that would be my only worry about like attaching a philosopher's name to what we need to move forward, right? But if we could maybe think, this anti-realism, what I call epistemic anti-realism, that makes possible metaphysical realist engagements in humble, deliberative, democratic ways, my goodness, that seems like a really positive way forward wherever our subspecialty and questions lie.
Bob, I was wondering whether you have anything to add on to that, and also whether I suppose what's come quite clear is there's these certain paradigm shifts which occur in philosophy. You have this paradigm shift, to use Kuhn's idea of Kant, I suppose, transforming the way we thought about the very possibilities of thought, and you push it back, and then you have, I suppose, Plato with his conception of the good, and Platonism like ages before Kant, but nonetheless that was a significant paradigm shift. So I suppose, firstly, do you have anything to say about what Aaron said, and also, is it even possible for us to move beyond these various paradigm shifts in philosophy as philosophers in the 21st century?
Well, I think that as Aaron pointed out, there are problems with, as we're going back to Kant. I mean, that was the battle cry of the neo-Kantian tradition, because there's not really a unique Kant for us to go back to. There are fundamental, like the distinction between things in themselves and appearances, the nature of Kant's idealism, his solution or solutions to the problem of freedom and determinism. They're all up for an interpretation of crucial terms in Kant's philosophy, cognitive terms, and so on. They're all up for grabs, even amongst orthodox Kant scholars. And so, any way, if it were possible in any way to go back to Kant, or as I think, go forward to Kant, we'd have to allow for this great pluralism of interpretations. And so you have to, as it were, reconstruct your own Kant in order to go forward. But if everyone were doing that, it seems to me there would be at least some sort of a level playing field for saying, well, I'm going this way, you're going that way. Another way we could go at Kant would be to focus on his political philosophy, and in particular on his concept of enlightenment and a radicalized version of that. And so I think that even philosophers who might be, anti-realists or realists or metaphysical realists or metaphysical, somewhere skeptics, could agree with the political aims, even if they were prepared to bracket the metaphysical questions. And so again, engaging with Kant's philosophy in that sense could be, a highly diverse activity. Why do I think that, just to come back to this question, why do I think that it should be Kant we should be going back to? Well, that's the history of philosophy. I mean, the history of Western philosophy, as it were, developed through the, ancient philosophy and the medieval tradition, and then early modern philosophy. And then Kant, this shrimpy 5'3" guy with a gray wig, we've all come out from under his wig in the sense that he brought together and criticized the rationalist and empiricist traditions, set the framework, and then everything since then has been, a series of footnotes to Kant. And so our access to the rest of the philosophical truth, go back to Plato, go back to the pre-Socratics, go back to Aristotle, fine, but it seems to me that it would always have to be refracted through, the lens of Kantian philosophy. So that, I think it's that historical, did we ask for Kant to set philosophy's parameters in a certain way? No, but that's just the way the tradition has gone. If we rejected philosophy, if we rejected Kant, root and branch, I think we'd be rejecting philosophy as we know it, root and branch. Now, there's still this question of professional academic philosophy, which is a highly structured development that Kant was just at the very beginning of, when he was, in a way, he was the first professional academic philosopher. And in a sense, he was the last truly great professional academic philosopher, because he was still struggling against the institutionalization of philosophy. So for me, it's that the pressure to just do philosophy, engage with tradition, think autonomously, and what the professional academy is telling you ought to do, namely, pursue your career climb the greasy pole of, tenure and promotion, hyper specialize, don't annoy your senior colleagues, do what the administration tell you to do. And it's highly restrictive, I think. And that's I think, where the real problem lies.
And I suppose I would love to go back into this academic discussion of the state of academic philosophy later on in this discussion. But carrying on down this road, Aaron, can you tell us a bit more about what progress looks like in philosophy, especially from your perspective? What does it seem like, or what should we be expecting philosophy to be doing if we were to think that it was moving in a positive direction? Because a lot of people say, well, philosophers are just trying to find the truth, but what exactly that can realize itself seems to be quite elusive when you actually think about it. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
I can try. So I think, importantly, philosophy has got to be articulated and understood, as it historically has been, as two very different possible spheres of human thinking. One, as Bob's been talking about, is this, I would just call it professional philosophy, right? Alternatively, we have what Aristotle talks about when he says that philosophy begins in wonder, or when Plato's talking about the love of wisdom, or somebody who's influential on my thought, Pierre Hadot, goes back and says, look, philosophy for the Greeks writ large was a way of life. It was more like a cultural movement and a mode of existential engagement than it was some discourse conducted by people that we recognize as experts or scholars, right? And so I think we've got to understand that when we say, well, what would progress look like in philosophy, we have to distinguish, well, which version of philosophy? And my academic career has nearly exclusively, up until about 4 years ago, been focused on the professional space. And I think there's some real good here in a time where expertise is being undermined and institutions of social trust are being eviscerated, such that we no longer can have appropriate epistemic trust in epistemically well-positioned authorities, right? Something that should be just foundational to social life. If I want my car oil changed, I'm probably not going to go seek out a computer scientist. I'll seek out an auto mechanic, right? So the very basic level of our social arrangement depends on differently epistemically positioned authorities relative to expertise being possible in different discursive spaces. So I'm a fan of professional philosophers writing and engaging and being almost exclusively concerned about other professional philosophers' opinions, right? This is what we call peer review. And so in that space, most of my career has been right there. Progress, I would say, is defined as, and this will sound way too Rortian, and I apologize because I'm not actually a Rortian, but I think he's right about this. Progress would look like, well, answering the questions that people in that space think are good questions to ask. So it becomes a very insular, self-referential kind of definition. But I think it has to be, because otherwise we are, again, appealing to a kind of objectivist standard by which we do this thing. So we could say, well, professional philosophers are seeking truth relative to the questions of professional philosophy. But what counts as truth is something being judged by the peer and colleague engagement and mutual self-evaluation occurring among the professional field. And I think that's the way it should be. The same thing happens in science, right? The same thing happens in, whatever the discourse or human practice is. That's different, I think, than what goes on if we think about progress in philosophy as a way of life or as an existential disposition. That would be available for mechanics and teachers and plumbers and professional philosophers, right? As members of this shared social space. There, which is what I've been focusing on the last 4 or 5 years in my career, I think progress looks like what Socrates invites us to think progress looks like. Are we inviting meaningful existence amid social flourishing in ways that promote generally a expanded concern for reason giving and evidence-based belief, right? So are we doing, like the question in politics, right? Are you better now than you were 4 years ago? I would actually say, well, I don't think we are. And so I would think, not just economically, but just as humans, as people, as mutual recognizers of each other's dignity, I think we're worse at that than we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so as a result, I think philosophy would find progress if it starts raising the level of human engagement about the human condition such that meaningful existence becomes actually the task we are inviting each other to engage in, right? So I would say both of they're not unconnected, right? So the professional work is certainly going to inform what we do then when we go over and try to do public philosophy. But I think that there is a good reason to think professional philosophical engagement does not need to be answerable to legislatures, to the masses, right? Socrates rightly says that in the Credo, why would we be concerned about the majority? We should only be concerned about the virtuous. And though a PhD in philosophy does not guarantee one's virtue, it does position one as a relevant assessor of the discourse of professional engagement. So that would be my answer. Both of these are important, but in a time where I'm genuinely starting to be worried about the future of something called professional philosophy, some of it's self-imposed and a product of our own insularity and our own over-specialization and all this, which we can talk about. But a lot of it also is external challenges as the humanities are under attack. Liberal arts is being gutted. The relevance of higher education to human flourishing is being challenged. I think unless more professional philosophers are willing to do more of the public or philosophy as a way of life stuff, I fear that we may not have much of a community of professionals very long.
Aaron's given us a lot to think about. Bob, what do you think about these different strands of philosophy?
Well, I completely agree with the distinction between philosophy as a profession on the one hand, and inside the professional academy, and philosophy as a calling, philosophy as a way of life on the other hand. And like Aaron, I'm strongly oriented towards, or committed to philosophy as a profession. Philosophy as a calling and philosophy as a way of life. I think I'm more negative about the profession. I think in part because my own experience of professional philosophy, well, maybe it was unusually bad, but in any case, I always felt as though they were trying to kill the thing I love. So I got into philosophy because I truly love philosophy and I wanted to be able to think for myself and feel for myself and act for myself. And I was always being told, no, look to the writer report, look to our status as a department, publish more and more and more. I mean, I didn't mind writing and publishing. But in any case, but then they were telling me, oh, no, you can't work on this because we've already got someone who's a specialist in this, even though they're not even working in that area anymore. And so just the ability to be a committed generalist was something that I was constantly struggling with. When I got out of academic philosophy, then sort of two things struck me. One was I still had lots of friends inside professional philosophy, some of whom had shared critical worries with me. But the problem was that it became very difficult for them. This is what we call the double life problem in our discussions. It became very difficult for them to share the criticisms and be inside that social institution. And I don't think we ever quite resolved it. Those who, finally realized that, they couldn't live this double life. They couldn't, as it were, be, an against professional philosophy person in the evenings and a inside professional philosophy person during the daytime. That's too difficult to unify your life. And so they just tended to subside back into becoming, competent, successful professionals. On the other hand, those on the outside tended to be rejected by those on the inside. And so what I think should have been the case is that those of us on the outside should have been working in collaboration with all their, as it were, friends on the inside, both of them trying to create, a new way or a way of being, committed to philosophy as a calling and doing it as a way of life. The one problem with that, I mean, that's not one problem, but one of the big problems with that is, how are you going to support yourself outside the professional academy? So suppose you've done the whole, gone through graduate school, got your PhD, you have a job, you leave. Who's going to pay you? Who's going to support you to live outside the tradition? And in my case, my wife supported me, but she stayed inside the academy and was a professional academic as well. Now we're both retired, but for 10, 15 years, she just supported me to do philosophy on the outside. But most people don't have a patron or a second career that coheres perfectly with philosophizing. I think that's possible. And some of the people associated with the Against Professional Philosophy Circle have other careers, but the way they've configured their careers is that they're flexible with their philosophical work. But that's unusual, and it also requires 24/7 work too, to maintain your career and write philosophy and talk philosophy. So it's difficult, but I do completely agree with Aaron that moving towards, especially in the political situation in the world, but also particularly in the United States, and I'm speaking from Canada, so I can have a kind of, sanctimonious looking down our noses at the US, but, I can see the problems, the huge problems. Yeah. And philosophy's got to step up to that challenge.
And
I would just add here, the elbows up. We don't need a 51st state because you guys are doing your own thing. And I think it's amazing what a bizarre world in which to live. Right.
Right.
But the thing that I would just add is your earlier comment about this sort of hyper specialization, hyper professionalization that has in many ways created now the power structure that requires a kind of self-replicating professional discourse.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful book I highly recommend called The Evidence That the Liberal Arts Needs, written by Richard Detweiler. And it's fantastic because it's all about the story of how we moved as a generally, again, Western culture from roughly 2,500 years or so of broad, liberal, artsy, cross-disciplinary calling to be social good and engage citizenry and responsible adults. That shifted very recently, all things considered, right? In roughly the 19th century, we started becoming very technical and specialized. And it's linked to the rise of what we would now call modern science. Now, thank goodness for modern science, right? I have lots of COVID vaccines in me, and I'm thrilled to have them as I stay healthy when friends of mine aren't. So none of this is a critique of the importance of science. It is, however, a critique of the scientism that can begin to narrow the mode in which reflective engagement and human flourishing can happen. And so when scientism takes off, STEM disciplines don't just become an important space where we need smart people, which is trivially true. They become the only fields where good work can happen, the only definitions by which progress could be articulated, right? And as that occurred, well, how is it that you're going to hang in with that? And you've already talked about it, Bob. Analytic philosophy says, hey, we'll do that too. And so modern science, natural science becomes its, not just model, but I would say it's idolatry move. And that commitment then makes philosophy less and less and less a humanistic liberal art and much, much, much more you might say natural science, but without the outcomes that can be turned into patents and transformed into corporate profits. So we're screwed on this model. Now, so is English and religious studies and history. So this is not us. This is the fate of the humanities because somehow we bought into the idea. And then as we corporatized higher education and started hiring CEOs as university presidents instead of idea leaders, we hired accountants, right? And that move has unsurprisingly led exactly where it was intended to lead, which is the erasure of everything that cannot be commodified. Well, we don't have a very long history of the successful commodification of meaningful existence, right? And so that's the thing I would want to say, that Bob's given us all the resources to then bring together. And then Detweiler in his book gives us actually the social science to show us, when you think pre-professionalism is the task of higher ed, you will make not only lives that are more likely to be depressive, but also lives that are less likely to be socially engaged, less likely to foster empathy as a social good, and more likely to think money defines value. And yet they're less likely to make money. So it turns out pre-professional education is counterindicative to actual lifetime earnings relative to liberal arts education as a goal, right? Because there's different value sets running behind the scenes, impacting why we do what we do, and then finding meaning in what we do. So for me, that's the real task. And that's why I think public philosophy, not as an exclusive good, but really important right now, is because I think public philosophy will be what saves the possibility of professional philosophy moving forward.
Bob, do you have anything to add on to that?
I completely agree with that. And then we'll just re-emphasize the idea that those of us, not very many, working outside the professional academy should be working in collaboration and in league with, friends working inside the professional academy, both trying to forward the aims that Aaron was just describing. So that, I think, is the true future, the true progressive future of philosophy, and rejecting the neoliberalization of the academy, to the hilt. Now, does that make it possible to stay inside the professional academy? Can the professional academy modify itself from within, and not, so there's not a neoliberal enterprise, and still, hold together? I don't know. But if you've got, people using the, weapons of the weak inside the academy, pushing back, foot dragging, changing, saying things in their classes that the administration doesn't want to hear, and that, that government doesn't want to hear, there would be progress, I think.
And what does this progress, I suppose, look like from the perspective of, I suppose, a philosophical work? And I will delve into more the practical academic side of academic philosophy very shortly. But I also want to, I suppose, we've seen a lot of problems, I guess, both in the academic side and also with some of the problems of the development of thought and kind of this natural sciencey direction of philosophy. What are some of the ways in which philosophy can go forward? So someone's like thinking, well, how should I move philosophy forward? What should someone do? Or is our project more so to say, well, all right, there's loads of problems, let's try to remove that, and then just kind of open Pandora's box and see what happens? But hopefully this Pandora's box is a good box to open. Bob, do you have any ideas about that?
Well, I think that, and I think probably Aaron agrees with this, philosophy is the pursuit of truth, but there's objective truth, and then there is, as it were, Kierkegaardian subjective truth, the truth of the person becoming what we already are, and self-realization, existential self-realization. And I think that philosophy should be pursuing both of those, not in tension with one another, but coherently with one another. And if that involves rejecting the professional academy, that's fine. If it involves working, as a mole, as it were, inside the professional academy, that's fine. Working with people outside the academy, that's fine. But it should be those, we should be pursuing truth, both the objective and the subjective senses. We should also be pushing the idea that you can be pro-science, strongly and seriously pro-science, and anti-scientistic. And one of my most recent book is called, Science for Humans. So the idea is, you develop a broadly Kantian, broadly humanistic picture of the natural science and natural and formal sciences, and it actually solves some problems within the natural and formal sciences. And at the same time, it would then connect with the traditional aims of the humanities. And then that would involve changing science, the way we think about science and the way scientists think about their own enterprise. But it would help the sciences as much as it would help those outside the sciences and in the humanities to be able to have that, interaction and, a common understanding between the two of them. So we should be thinking a lot. We shouldn't be rejecting science. We should be thinking about the sciences, but in a critical way.
Aaron, what do you think about that? And I suppose what are your thoughts about the progress of philosophy?
Yeah. No, I mean, my Pentecostal blood just wants to say amen to that. But then I would add, it's important when we start thinking about, well, what's required in order to challenge scientism. It's not just, and Bob's already kind of hinted at this, it's not just an intellectual enterprise. It's a structural one. Right? Like, notice what's happening right now with the Trump administration pulling funding for all kinds of things. Like, universities are shutting down graduate programs. They're suspending admission. They're freezing hiring, because it turns out the money that is supporting academic philosophy is largely being sort of, resourced, not from, just say, the people or the public good, but from corporate interests that are pouring in to say, we need you to produce objective truth that allows us to then make more money in this marketplace, right? Mm-hmm. And that might be a critique of capitalism, but it doesn't have to be. Right. So when we are aware of this, that doesn't mean, therefore, Marxists get together and start storming barricades. It may just mean we've got to understand the workings of capital behind the scenes for what we call professional work. Right. And man, right now we are realizing how fragile human inquiry is when money is pulled away from it. Right. And so that would be my suggestion of, well, how then can we start to be better at understanding that and then pushing back on it? I think, drawing on the tradition of continental thought, Michel Henry's book, Barbarism, which is a sustained critique of scientism, anchored in Galileo and Copernicus and in Descartes. Like, it goes all the way back and says, this new turn to scientism is an old gesture that has now become so ingrained we can't even see it as a gesture. It's just the way things are. Welcome to the real world, right? Which is the way that universities are now selling themselves. Come here, spend your money at College X. We'll give you real world experience. And then all the philosophers should say, whoa, the real world, that's an interesting suggestion. Which world are we talking about? Whose reality, right? And as soon as we do that work, the administrators look at us and say, oh, you guys are an absolute useless bunch of faculty. Let me get people who need NIH funding because they will play by the rules of capital, right? So our very narrative of the necessity of the real world is anchored in this structural reality that scientism is connected to profit. And Henry, better than any book I have ever read, illustrates that and calls us to what he says is the real development of culture. And what is culture? Art, ethics, and religion, he says. Now, he means those in very expansive ways, right? So this is not an anti-science move. It's saying now we can see science as a kind of art, right? It's a kind of human endeavor meant to make human beings flourish relative to their natural circumstances, right? Now we can think about religion not as a determinate set of propositional pro-attitudes relative to theism, but religion now becomes an orientation toward ultimacy that causes us to rethink our structures of value that are reducible to exchange currencies, right? So what Henry does is, I think, presents in a beautiful way the challenge before us. up until really the 19th century, I would say maybe even post-World War II, depending on how in the weeds we want to get, the university was the locus of culture creation. We were the space. It was the place where we figured out, in tension with each other, in disagreement, in plural discourse, we thought, what should be made real? What world should be actualized? It's as if we were all Molinist gods sitting around looking at possible worlds, right? Now that has stopped. Universities are no longer culture creators. They are culture reflectors. And the problem is they are reflecting a culture that is actively barbarous, actively undermining the very stakes of culture itself. And that's the place where I think we then slip as the frog in the, water that just gradually gets hotter. When we realize, whoa, something's wrong, we've got an epistemological well that is so deep and so poisoned, it just looks like we are troublemakers rather than we are prophets, right? And or we're madmen, in a Nietzschean sense, right? Shouting into the dark. So that would be my suggestion: is we've got to find ways to throw our shoes into the gears, right? Which is the original narrative of sabotage, throwing your sabo into the gears of the system, not because we are nihilists, not because we are Luddites, not because we are opposed to economic prosperity, but because we're trying to point out that what we take as necessary just isn't. It can be otherwise. And unless that invitation is handed to third graders and we stop telling them, what are you going to do for your career? And we start saying, hey, what do you think's beautiful? What would it look like to make that happen? I asked my students at a university the other day, how many times have you been told you've got to do something practical? All of them raised their hands, right? How many times have you been asked, what are you going to do after graduation? All of them raised their hands. I said, how many of you have been asked by your professors at this supposedly liberal arts university, hey, what do you think could be possible if we thought differently? Not one hand went up. For me, that's the failure of philosophy, but it's bigger, the failure of human civilization, as we become barbarous while applauding our wealth.
And that's fascinating. And I suppose the question then arises, we've been touching and flirting with this idea of academic philosophy and what direction should go towards. Dr. Hanna, you've talked a lot about with your work in Philosophy Without Borders and again professional philosophy, a lot about, well, how exactly should the world of academic philosophy go? Is it a reframing of philosophy? Sometimes I think about this channel as a way to allow for everyone to engage with the history of philosophy and philosophical ideas. Is that the direction we should go? Should professional philosophers have the burden almost to enter into the public space to kind of create another edifice of philosophy for people to engage with? Or is it to fundamentally reshape and reform professional philosophy? How exactly should we engage with it? What's the burden of professional philosophy?
Well, I think it's actually both of those. So, with an emphasis on the first. So moving forward, looking for aims and committing to aims other than neoliberal aims. And then to the extent that if they're still inside the professional academy, to the extent that they can, reshaping the professional academy, redesigning it as a social institution, and then trying to move forward, again, in collaboration, in solidarity with those, and not just philosophers outside the professional academy, but with everyone outside the professional academy. And that quote unquote public philosophy, the aim of public philosophy is to not just to present, complicated philosophical ideas in an accessible way. It's rather to, pursue projects that are good for people, universal projects that are good for people as such, and that promote respect for human dignity, and then move forward in that way. Now, in that sense, it's Kantian again, right? If what we think is what's the highest good? Oh, the dignity of rational human animals, or the dignity of rational animals, the absolute worth of persons, and everything we do as philosophers should be oriented towards promoting the fundamental aims, the fundamental elements of a dignified person and a dignified life. And if that involves staying in the academy and working hard there, that's one thing. If it involves being outside, that's another thing. If it involves collaborations between people inside and outside, that's the way we should be going. And so I wouldn't tell, if someone said, oh, should I go into professional philosophy, try to become a professional academic, I wouldn't say, no, don't do it. The way a few people said to me in the 70s, yeah, don't go there, Bob, go back, it's a trap. I think I would say, here are the problems and here are the prospects. If you're willing to take those on board, go ahead and try it. But don't be fooled into, a line I heard many, many times, which was, well, I'll play the game for about 10 years and then I'll do what I want to do. And in fact, they played the game and they never got beyond the game, because the game inside professional philosophy, the game never ends, really. So you've got your first job, you've got tenure, you've got promotion. Then they say, but you got to be promoted. And if you're not promoted, you're a quote unquote stalled associate or whatever it is that they call you. And then once you're a full professor, then they say, well, you've got to win prizes or get fellowships or whatever. And then you pursue those, and then you're retired. And you're emeritus faculty, and it's too late. And it's not that someone might say, oh, I'll go outside the academy as an emeritus professor and do the amazing things that I always wanted to do. But actually, by and large, they don't. They just, they may just play golf all the time or garden, or they may do some more academic work, but it's all within the, the limited conveyor belt framework that they came from. So telling young, philosophers, aspirational philosophers, about those problems, and then turning them loose and seeing what they do.
Aaron, and I know you engage with a lot of undergraduates in your time at Furman, and as well, you were talking about how your thoughts about what does philosophy mean if universities collapse or seem to be collapsing, and what should we do? And of course, your work with the YouTube channel. What are your thoughts about this discussion, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. So, I just wrote a letter for you to go get a PhD in philosophy. So I realize there's a kind of strange discourse where when we're talking about these imaginary people wanting to do this stuff, like you're one of them, right? And you've never heard from me, I hope, don't do it, it's horrible, run. That's not the message that I tell my students. It's not the message that I, convey to people that I'm trying to support. It's instead a message that says, look, we were called to be faithful, not successful in whatever we do. So why is it you want to go do this thing? And a perfectly good answer is, I just like it. I think it's fun. Perfectly legitimate to me. But that then means, well, okay, what if it doesn't work out economically, financially, professionally, the way that you might hope? Are you good? Are you okay? No one, in my opinion, says, oh, I wish I didn't have this PhD. I wish I weren't educated. What they say is, man, I wish I didn't have $120,000 in debt from that degree that now hasn't translated to the kind of job I thought it would yield me, right? So what we've got to do is disconnect studying advanced professional philosophical discourse from the idea that we do this in order then to go spend our lives in the academy. Right. And I think that when I talk about the collapse of university, it might actually genuinely collapse. But I'm more worried about what happens is we turn it into a thing that is actually dehumanizing to the people who are spending their lives in it. So, for example, in preparation for today, I did a little bit of digging into the number of jobs in the US for professional philosophy openings basically for the last 20, 22 years. There was a weird spike that happened about 10 years ago, and they got kind of really high. There was like 1,400 jobs a year for a minute. But if you go back to 2003 and look like in comparison to 2023, they're not fundamentally different. So it's not like over the last 20, 25 years, we've seen this just steep decline in openings for academic philosophers. What's happened is we've seen a shift from tenure track and permanent positions to contingent and term positions. So the jobs are there. The problem is what those jobs look like invite more like a professional musician's life, hop in the van and play for tips. It becomes almost like an itinerant philosopher kind of way of living. And that is something I think that is probably not what most of the people who love their senior seminar in existentialism envision as the best life that they could live into. So that's what I would try to remind people is, look, if you can go to graduate school, stay low debt, do this in a way that, hey, if it works out and you land an academic position, that's something you want to do, awesome, ride the wave. But if that doesn't happen, you got an amazing opportunity for 5, 6, 7 years to think at the highest levels available in this space among the ostensibly best experts in the field thinking about those things. I think that's awesome. Now, to flip it though, the professors in those spaces have got to be, I'm not at a research university, though I do direct dissertations fairly frequently. And when I'm serving in that role, I've had to flip the point. Like what I'm there to do is to help them be strategic. How can we help them be as good as possible on the job market? Yes, they've got to publish 5, 6 essays before they go out. Yes, did you go to one of the better schools because, even though it's dumb, that's part of the game. Like you help them be strategic. But at the same time, what I do is keep asking the graduate students as they're finishing their dissertations. I'm defending a guy next weekend. And I keep asking him, hey, you've got 2 kids, man. What is it about what you're writing that you think, if true, makes their life better? And if there's no answer to that, we probably should start asking different questions, right? So that's where, for me, the philosophy as a way of life and philosophy as profession intersect. So I've become the kind of annoying senior faculty member in the back of the room at conferences, throwing my hand up saying, oh, wow, thank you so much. What an interesting argument. I have one simple question. What if you're right? So almost never do I get answers that are substantive, right? It's, well, then 5 of my friends have to hold different views. Right. And so that's the thing that I think I would be pushing on is I don't want all professional philosophers just to be YouTubers, right? Which, God bless you, Josh, you're doing amazing work, right? But it's important that the public philosophers start emerging because they're also the best in the game. They're the best in the field. And you're on your way there, man. Like you're going to go get that PhD. I hope you don't stop doing the YouTube channel when you're also writing books with Oxford. You can do both. But my hunch is your books with Oxford will probably be more interesting, more accessible, more robust books because of your experience having to navigate the public in comment sections on YouTube, right? And that's where I think I'm losing patience. I'll put it this way. This is definitely the crotchety old get off my lawn sounding guy. I've lost patience for the senior members of departments holding positions that do spend their summers just vacationing, that haven't published in 5 years, that are then the ones whining about the state of the field, ticked because their salaries are frozen and telling their undergrads not to become like them. I got no patience for it. If you're annoyed by this, then freaking change the field, make it different. You've got the power, you've got the status, you've got the voice. So change what it looks like and make it possible for the people currently in your graduate program to have a different life relative to a field that looks different. And right now, that's what I'm seeing some starting to get energetic about. But the vast majority are still just, ticked off because they don't like Zoom and they're mad about AI and they can't give the papers like they used to give. I just don't have the energy anymore for it. Right. I'm like, you know what? We've got a society that is now dehumanizing people with disabilities, taking away rights from women, trying our best to minimize the status of anybody who isn't wearing a MAGA hat. And you think the real issue we face as professional thinkers about human excellence and truth is my favorite person X reads person Y relative to issue Z more interestingly than person Q does? It's like an old Marx Brothers skit. If you take a tomato and you stew it like a rutabaga, it takes way more like an asparagus than carrots do. Like, we've let that be okay.
Yeah.
And that's the point at which I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to do everything I can with whatever credibility I've gained by publishing hard in the space among technical philosophers to translate that and then use that capital to open doors for people who are going to come in and replace me and be better than me and open doors and do it differently, because that's the only hope I've got for my son to inherit a world that isn't the garbage pile that we are currently letting it become. That sounded way too preachy. I apologize, but I just don't think we can keep wringing our hands about the field without saying, all right, y'all in the field, freaking fix it, change it. Are you willing to lose your job not to let it become adjuncted? No, right? I mean, not every, some do, but famously what we're doing is fussing about stuff in faculty meetings, but then not refusing to continue to go down with a sinking ship. Right. And I just think we've got to do something bold. We've got to start finding our voice. We've got to start opening doors for those who are coming behind us, rather than being self-protective about the way that we did it when we were in grad school, because that's the only thing we know. That's the easiest way to make ourselves irrelevant. And we should be, if that's the way we're going to keep going.
Amen.
Yes.
Yep. I completely agree.
And Bob, how do you think we can, I suppose, from your perspective, how can we, I was talking to one of the grad admissions people at Stanford, and they're like, we got 417 applications this year. And I was like, that's a lot of people applying. And there's probably way more than just people applying to Stanford out there. And I was like, that's kind of crazy. To all these grad students who are applying for PhDs, grad school, all that stuff, what type of mindset should they do? Because I suppose in some sense, and this is something I think a lot about, is like, you kind of have to play with the game. And I'm somewhat suffering the consequences of submitting a writing sample on Dostoevsky and the Problem of Evil. And in hindsight, I was like, that's probably not the smartest thing to do applying to philosophy in the States. But there is that question of where you kind of have to play the game. You kind of don't need to play the game. And, what is the advice and what is the role of this next upcoming generation of philosophers? What should, I suppose, we be doing or trying to achieve with our attempts?
Well, the problem is, as I said before, the double life problem, where you're torn in two directions. If you want to go forward in the professional academy, you really do have to play the game up to a certain point. At the same time, you've got to keep asking yourself, have I become a mere player? Am I now a player and nothing but a player? And once you've actually finished your PhD, you've got a job, you've published a sufficient amount, then push back against the whole system. It's really hard. It's really, really hard to do. Because of course there are ways of punishing you, even when you're already tenured, even when, you can't get that promotion, or you can't get fellowships, or, you can't achieve the high status that other philosophers who are better games players are achieving, and so you'll suffer by it. So I think you just have to take a kind of stoic view of the thing, and so you say, I'm going to get to this level, then I'm going to do it and really mean it and carry it out. Then I'm going to go forward in the way I think it ought to. I ought to be going forward. I'm going to act as someone who is pursuing philosophy as a calling. Can I, as part of my pursuit of philosophy as a calling, play the game minimally? Yeah, you have to. Otherwise, you just leave, and you'd never, you'd never be admitted to a PhD program, even far less making your way, climbing up the, slithering up the greasy pole.
That's right.
But you've got to have that critical and not allow you to pull you apart. I mean, it's a challenge. It really is a challenge. Still, I would encourage people who truly love philosophy and want to have a life, a career pursuing it, to have pursue a double life strategy self-consciously and not get torn apart by it, but somehow use it to their own benefit, and try to change. So I'm keen on young people, right? Young people, you go do it. Don't give up too early. Don't listen to all the boo cynicism on the internet. Shut off your phone every so often. Read classic texts. Be a booster of philosophy as a calling, and go for it, and see if you can do better than we did.
Yeah, amen. I would just add two things to that. One is something I was told when I was applying for my PhD out of my master's degree. And one of my letter writers, a person I respect very, very, very highly, did something that I have now continued in my own career, where he gave me the letter he had written for me. And he said, look, if I'm going to say stuff about you, you need to know what I've said. And so I give my letters to everybody I write letters for. But something he said in that letter was, and this is so funny in retrospect, Bob, you'll get a kick out of this. He said, one of the most interesting things about Simmons is that he continues to think that it is worth his time to ask very big questions about very deep things. Now, you might think the next sentence was, and isn't that amazing? No. The next sentence was, although I see this as perhaps a detractor for his ability to gain traction in the field, ultimately, I think it could turn out to serve him well, right? So the very idea that I was like actually thinking, what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? Right. What does it mean to think of God? What is? Yeah, eventually, this might turn out to be okay, right? So I actually encourage my students at undergraduate level, what are the big questions that get you out of bed? That's got to be the impetus, the springboard, the frame where we then start finding, all right, now in the profession, what are spaces where that big stuff can be engaged and interrogated in narrow ways that then respect the discipline, right? And that's the second point I would make is ask big questions, think big, interrogate, wrestle, put question marks where everybody puts periods, but then be strategic, right? It's really, really, really important to say, like for you, if you're thinking, I want to think about Dostoevsky and the problem of evil, you say, okay, well, what's the single most likely space that will change everything about our thinking in the next 20 years? Well, it's AI, hands down, without question. Well, it turns out the problem of evil and AI is a fascinating intersection. Now, it might look a little bit different than you might want it to look, right? Because you're wanting to ask questions about, Wesleyan theology or something. And what this discourse needs are people to show up and say, when we think about the problem of evil relative to AI, what we're actually doing is interrogating the moral inputs that allow back propagation to function as we're training large language models. Well, who's actually bearing moral blame if stuff goes wrong? What if AI is now our new model of omnipotence and omnibenevolent? Not again in ways that require us to be atheistic or sacrilegious or something, but just in practical ways. The most power that any human product has ever harnessed is right now an algorithm. And it might be omnibenevolent if we teach it right. Right. So notice that would be my suggestion to the people coming out is, hey, can we take your big question and then go get tea and think about what are versions of that question intersecting with the most prominent issues that are emerging in the field today? And that's how I think you find the energy to keep doing this, whatever happens economically and professionally.
Mm. That's very fascinating. And your talk about probably even AI just allowed me to think actually that my dissertation topic could probably be twisted in quite a fascinating way. So that's some food for the summer after I finish these finals at the end of this year. I suppose slowly wrapping up with this interview, I mean, both of you have had such wonderful careers in academia and have written and contributed greatly to your respective fields. To perhaps summarize this or conclude this video is to think about or tell us a bit more about, well, what are some thoughts you have of being a professor of philosophy? What were some of the benefits, the downsides, what you enjoyed, got most out of, what you didn't like, I suppose, for people who are watching this, so to see whether they are also interested in going down that path. Dr. Hanna, would you like to start?
Well, the benefits were obvious, and that was interacting with students, right? So teaching was good. Discussion groups, I always had discussion groups going alongside. I got involved in even writing a book with some of my students, interactions with graduate students. That was really positive and wonderful. And it was a great help for me to sustain me through many years of not liking professional academic philosophy, and for the reasons I described before. So the thing I liked about it was students and the thought that you could do serious philosophy with genuine colleagues other than my professional colleagues who were typically narrow-minded twits, although perhaps brilliant in their areas and so on. And so the contrast between going from a department meeting on a Friday to ruin your weekend, right? And then on Monday or whatever, having a discussion with graduate students and undergraduates was night and day, right? So that this is real. This is why I do philosophy. This is the kind of thing I'm interested in. And this other garbage is driving me crazy and trying to kill the thing I love. And so focus on those parts of professional academic philosophy that come closest to your ideal of philosophy as a calling. That's what I would say, is pursue those. And so students can, get directly engaged with their profs. Just tell them that you love this. Could you do a reading group on this? Can we talk? Can you do an independent study on this, that, and the other thing? That was what sustained me.
Aaron?
Yeah, I certainly resonate with some of that. I think I would frame it maybe slightly differently, just because I've spent my entire career at undergraduate institutions. And so I would say one of the things that I would encourage those looking at this field to think about is teaching. When we watch Dead Poets Society, like I did every single night before the fall semester for over a decade when I started my career, there's this sort of romanticization that on the ground can be exactly as Bob describes, right? It can be, this is actually life-giving. It is amazing. You're inviting people to think with you about stuff that matters. And it's an age, 18 to 25-ish, where like they're still open to thinking, right? And so I absolutely want to support that. But I also want to say the life of a professor is also one that can be very monotonous. When you encounter yet another group of 18-year-olds who can't understand why they need to take this stupid class because they're on their way to med school, and you're trying to say, woohoo, look at Plato, and like they couldn't give two craps about it, right? So there is also an exhaustion for me that what I differentiate teaching and doing philosophy with students. I've never actually loved teaching, something I can only say for what it's worth because I'm a tenured full professor who's not being evaluated on such things anymore. But I love genuinely doing philosophy with students, right? And so I was able to parse those as two different kinds of engagements. Now, I often do philosophy with students in the front of a class that I am teaching, but teaching has become more and more and more and more and more dealing with accommodations, navigating complaints, responding to parents who are mad because they don't want their student to major in philosophy, responding to deans who are telling you you need to up your course enrollment caps, dealing with chairs that are telling you your grades are too high because students are too excited about your classes, review committees that once told me I couldn't publish so much and be so good in the classroom, so I must be just lacking the gravitas that they expect from a professor. And so they docked me 1 year. And I was like, because my evidence is too good? So teaching becomes an awful lot of, is this AI? Is this actually written? Was this plagiarized? Oh my goodness, one more account. Ugh, you can't start it saying Plato was a famous philosopher who. You know what? I identify as a religious person, but you can't start as a Christian So an awful lot of what we do as professors of philosophy is monotonous day in, day out stuff that David Foster Wallace describes in This Is Water. So I would want to remind people that so that they don't think it's John Keating all the time, right? But then what I would say has really been something that I find compelling. Again, still love doing philosophy with students, always have. That has never waned for me. But as my career has kind of progressed, I now see students as, like you put it, Bob, conversation partners and colleagues. And now I see that as way broader than what goes on in my classrooms. That happens in YouTube engagements. It happens on Substack conversations. It happens when I go across the country and give, talks on my latest book, right? It's conversations with retired people at an OLLI program last week in Georgia. Doing philosophy with colleagues, with conversation partners, with students is something that is just part of what it looks like to live a life committed to reflecting on things that matter. And I cannot praise that life more. It is unbelievably compelling. It is worthy of my finitude, and it's something I would recommend to everybody, right? That said, I don't want to diminish or not celebrate. And I know Bob would say the same thing. I mean, look at his publications, right? These are some technical books written by some serious presses, right? But I actually got into philosophy. My analogy is Wimbledon. Can you imagine going to Wimbledon to watch? That's so awesome, right? But if you're a tennis player, you want to be on center court playing. And so for me, I went to grad school not to be a spectator of the thoughts that other people had. I went to Vanderbilt and went crazy in debt that I do not recommend. I paid tuition on a visa because my loans weren't sufficient my first year. Do not recommend to anybody. I did that because I wanted to play in center court. Not for my ego, but because I thought this stuff mattered that much. And that's what I would encourage is make sure it matters. And if it matters, then be good at it. Just swing for the fences. Don't be told to narrow your horizons. Don't be told, hey, make sure you get an article or two. I had a graduate professor once told me, hey, Aaron, I really think you've got a lot of potential. I mean, I could see you maybe one day writing a book. I really think you've got that in you. But then when I got to Vanderbilt, I was surrounded by a few, not all, but some fellow grad students. And we started saying 1 every 5, 5 every 1. And what that meant was every 5 years, a book. Because if we're not publishing a book every 5 years, what are we doing? Why aren't we thinking more? Why aren't we engaging? What is it we're doing, right? And it wasn't publish or perish. We never had that mentality. It was never the grind. It was, this is what we get out of bed to do. And then 5 every 1, at least 5 articles, 5 conferences every single year, because otherwise we're stagnating. We're not keeping sharp. We're not being critiqued by the best in the field. So I love the sharpening of iron against iron that happens in the space where we go to think with the best in a space. I love that. So I would say philosophy with students, but it gets monotonous when you're just teaching the same stuff over and over and over and over and over. And B, yes, the professionalization can be soul crushing, but it also can be life-giving, amazing opportunities to think about the most important stuff with some of the most interesting people in history, right? So I have nothing but good things to say about philosophy. And then for what it's worth, once you've paid your dues, which is not grad school is what you do to be able to pay your dues for the next decade, right? But once you've done that, there is no job I know that offers more existential flexibility. It's not going to let you retire at 50. It's not going to provide money for the Porsche in the garage. You will always struggle to figure out, man, I hope my investments don't tank like they currently are, right? Stupid Trump. But what you will do is discover, if you will take it up, if you will embrace it, if you will grab it, the flexibility to navigate days differently as a result of your agency is possible. So I write now more than I did 10 years ago. It's just now I tend to write like between fishing, or I'll go mountain biking and then stop on top of a mountain and, on the way out of town, and I'm going to write another chapter. Like for me, the writing and the love and the engagement and the activity and the speaking, there is a future where all of that can come together, but that will be less and less and less possible if we allow the universities to become corporate shills for adjunct efficiency experts. And so we've got to fight to make possible that kind of life for the next generation.
Mm. Thank you very much for that. And I have to say, one of the things on my bucket list to do in America is to come over and go fishing with you in South Carolina, go catch some trout and
come
whatnot.
On over.
That is something that is definitely on my bucket list. Well, thank you so much for both of you coming onto the channel. I'm sure everyone who's watching this must have really enjoyed it. I mean, we've covered so much ground, and as someone who's considering going into the field of academia, this has been an absolute pleasure to have both of you on. Thank you once again for coming on, and of course, make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments below what you think about this discussion, and as well what other questions and topics in philosophy you would like to learn more about. Stay safe, see you soon, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua.